that, I think, even though people are still logging on, it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, who is Dr. Jonathan Jackson. He is the Executive Director of the Community Access Recruitment and Engagement, or CARE Research Center at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And I think he actually, if I say anything incorrect, Jonathan, please feel free to correct me. But I think he actually launched this center in 2017. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. So CARE investigates the impact of diversity and inclusion on the quality of human subjects research and tries to leverage the deep community entrenchment to build trust and overcome barriers, particularly for our clinical trial participation. But Dr. Jackson also has a whole other area of work as a research as a cognitive neuroscience, where he has investigated the early detection of Alzheimer's disease, particularly in the absence of memory problems. He graduated from Rice University and then went on to get his PhD at WashU. And he did his postdoc in Dr. Angela Guch's lab. And from there, he moved on to Mass General and finally to a faculty appointment at Harvard Medical School. And I think there's where you really begin to merge your worlds and your interest, if I can speak so boldly, where you tried to merge your scientific work with the elderly and cognitive neuroscience and your commitment to clinical trials and making sure that our clinical trials had adequate representation and looked like the populations of our communities. But he's also had many, many awards and has been funded by the the National Institutes of Aging, which included an NIH Pioneer Award. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who actually got a Pioneer Award. So congratulations on that one. Also by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And in 2020, he was named one of the 1,000 Inspiring Black Scientists in America by Cell Press. So I welcome you, Dr. Jackson, and I look forward to your presentation today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. DeLuca. I hope that I can live up to that kind of an introduction. I wasn't sure you were talking about me. It seems weird that that all of those things apply to me, but so hopefully I don't let anyone down. I am here today to talk to you about how we can start being a little bit more thoughtful and proactive when we are considering aspects of health equity. If you do take away one thing from today's talk, it is my hope that you understand why we should be thinking about health equity. I think in the last three-ish years, we have all collectively decided that it's important, but we haven't all collectively decided how to approach it, how to measure it, how to understand it, or even why it's important. So I'm going to try to give you my take as a scientist for why you should be a little bit more thoughtful about this in your research studies. So before we get started, I just wanted to offer my disclosures. This looks like a busier version of a disclosure slide. It's just a little bit more detailed. I'm telling you where my paychecks come from, where my research grants come from, where our community engagement activities are funded, and then I tell you where the money used to come from, and it doesn't anymore. Just because I think that even if it has been a few years since we were supported by the Amgen Foundation, for example, it's still important to know that 4 years ago we received a grant from them. I want to center this talk by stressing the fact that when we talk about health equities and a lack of inequities, I really do mean this in a very deep and in a very literal way. And I think that this is a really, really great way of grounding that discussion by opening with this talk from Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. This quote is really reverberating in my mind because we are, like we are every March, really celebrating, commemorating the anniversary the last of the Selma marches, and it was really at the end of those that he actually said this quote in Montgomery, Alabama, back in 1965. Um, and so, a really emergent question comes from the fact that even back in the 60s, so we're coming up on 60 years since someone like Dr. King uttered these words. What has changed since then? And I think more importantly, what's the same? So, as just another way of orienting us to today's discussion, I wanted to present just a brief clip from a NOVA special. So, hopefully, everybody is familiar with PBS's NOVA program. Back in 1993, so that's 30 years ago, believe it or not. Back in 1993, NOVA did a special on the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it's actually available free of charge on YouTube. It's a bit long, but it's really, really worth it. It's packed full of really great quotes and interviews. But I wanted to just have you orient to something that the narrator said. So again, the narrator was speaking in 1993 about events that were happening in the 1960s. So I just want you to listen to what he has to say and ask yourself whether there is still a message embedded in what he's saying that applies to us today in the 2020s.
During the turbulent years of the civil rights movement in Alabama, the study went on. The scientists continued to ignore this new force that shook the world around them. Instead, they watched and they waited to see what would happen next to the men of the study.
I thought this was a pretty illuminating clip. It was talking about the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. But gosh, 3 years after the murder of George Floyd, it seems like they might be talking about life today. So one of those things where the more things change, the more they kind of stay the same. Now, I want to know, though, after the Tuskegee syphilis study was ended, the Belmont Commission was formed in 1974. The Belmont Report was published in 1979. And that really laid the framework for the scientific enterprise that we are all part of today. But we know that there was still a major problem, which is that we didn't have much in the way of diversity. And in fact, there have been several dozen aspirational policies, guidelines, recommendations since the era of the Belmont Commission and the Belmont Report to try to fix this. But I want you to orient to kind of this last major bullet point here, which is that we tried to solve the problem about diversity by putting guardrails around certain populations. We didn't try to address the fundamental challenge there, which is that researchers were primarily looking for and primarily set up for identifying and recruiting convenient populations to the research studies. So what happened was, while we did, by and large, but not completely eliminate some of those past medical abuses, we didn't address the convenience factor. So that meant that instead of marginalized groups becoming convenient to recruit, they became convenient to exclude in favor of very privileged populations. And so there was like a really, really, difficult cost to that. And I think some might rightfully argue that the modern era of rapidly expanding health disparities that we see can also be traced back to the late 70s and early 80s, right when we made the switch in the way that we conduct clinical research, which ultimately powers a lot of our clinical care. So that really gives rise to a question, and I've got a few GIFs in here to help you understand how you might be feeling at this particular moment. We've got this necessity of conducting high quality clinical research designs, whether we're talking about embedded pragmatic clinical trials, N of one, smart designs, classic RCTs. We know that we need to do this at a very high level in order to feel confident about our results. When we introduce all of this squishy, touchy, feely health justice stuff, sometimes it seems like that might mess up our efforts. It seems like they are not easy to reconcile. And so this is a question that I get very often, which is, I want to do good science. I don't want to change a lot about that because I'm confident that this is high quality work, but I also want to incorporate health justice, but it doesn't seem like I can. So what do I do? For me, there are actually many answers to that question. And as we get to the end of this talk, I hope that I can invite some conversation and some discussion so that we can walk through what solutions might be useful for all of you there. I'll also be at Virginia Tech next week, so perhaps we can have those conversations in person. However, for me, the first step to trying to reconcile high quality, like really rigorous research with health justice starts with the second quote from Lou Lasagna, who said the incidence of patient availability sharply decreases when a clinical trial begins and returns to its original level as soon as the trial is completed. So we've got a very tongue-in-cheek quote here from Lou Lasagna. There's a corollary called Munch's third law, which says, take however many people you think are going to sign up for your study, divide it by 10, and that is a more accurate or appropriate estimate. In other words, this is, I think, a very tongue-in-cheek way of saying that we as researchers, especially research leaders, really have no idea how many patients come into our research studies. We have really no idea where our participants come from. It's a little bit of a black box. And so that gives rise to a lot of questions, not just about the representation of minoritized and marginalized individuals, but about representation, period. And it turns out that if we don't have a clear understanding of where our participants are coming from, it really raises big red flags about the quality of our science. So just to highlight the fact that I think many of us are fully aware that when you have a biased sample, if you can't generalize to the broader world or to a population in particular, it's going to threaten your external validity. You're not going to be able to generalize to that population as well as you might like to. It turns out, however, that when you don't have a really truly representative sample, it undermines a lot of the other fundamental validities that underpin causal estimation in clinical research. So we have threats not just to external validity, but also statistical conclusion validity, internal validity, and construct validity. And so that means that this is the first point of reconciliation, that when we have a truly representative population, which is oftentimes going to be a diverse one, then that helps enhance some of these problems that we often don't fully appreciate. So I wanted to give you just two quick examples of what it looks like when we don't recruit representatively. One of them I think is going to feel very familiar to you, and one of them is not. And so I want you to keep in mind that both of these are currently operational within our clinical research landscape. So the first one is from a paper that is getting a little older now, from Latrice Landry, published back in 2018, that looks at diversity and genotypic and phenotypic databases. It turns out that if you look at this in a bunch of different ways, it doesn't really matter how you slice it. We don't have that level of diversity. And so when people think about a lack of representation, they often think of something along these lines. It turns out that if you look at the latest figures, most of these numbers have not budged much in the last 5 years. There may have been some small progress in this other category, but generally speaking, we're not seeing that level of representation in the way that would be really beneficial and show a balanced level of representativeness. But before I move on, I wanted to highlight just a few things about this slide. So number one, we've got only 3 categories, which seems a little low when you're just trying to describe the entire human population on Earth. Number two, when we talk about the Europeans that are overrepresented in here, first things that we need to remember is that Europeans, especially white identifying Europeans, are not a global majority. They're about 16% of the U.S. of the global population. So seeing representation over 60%, approaching 80% in certain databases shows that there's an enormous level of representation. It turns out that it's actually worse than it at first appears, though, because this is not all Europeans. This is just Western European white individuals that primarily live in the United States. And it's not just those individuals, it is Western European white individuals that primarily live in the United States on the East or West Coast in large metropolitan areas. And so when you have that narrow of a group, conferring the majority and providing the majority of your data, that powers the next generation of healthcare as we start to move towards precision and personalized medicine, you're going to run into some problems. You can't do personalized medicine when you're representing a fraction of of the global population. The same is true of the Asian category in here. What is Asian even is, I think, a fair and valid question. But in this case, it's really talking about East Asians. From there, it's talking about Chinese individuals. And from there, it's talking about Han Chinese individuals that are, again, in urbanized centers within mainland China. And then everyone else that is not those two very narrow groups is kind of contained within this other category. So again, this is what we mostly think of when we talk about a lack of diversity, a lack of representation. It is dire. It is certainly worth operating on. But there is a representation that's a little bit more sinister. And so this is the one that we are more likely to do in our day-to-day as we are trying to achieve some level of diversity in our studies. So if you'll walk me through this, this is an example from my home area of dementia research. But what I just want to orient you to here is this is just a simple Kaplan-Meier curve looking at progression of a cross-sectional sample from unimpairment to mild cognitive impairment, and then from mild cognitive impairment to frank dementia. And so what you can see here is that if you compare white people and Black people, in the graph on the left, there's no racial difference. And the graph on the right, it does look like white individuals are much more susceptible to mild cognitive impairment or frank dementia relative to Black individuals. So what we're seeing here is that white individuals are at a higher likelihood of developing dementia than Black individuals. And so just, again, for those of you who may not be super familiar with Alzheimer's research, it doesn't work like that. One of the things that we know is that Black individuals are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop dementia relative to white individuals. And so what we see here is an inversion of that. And this is not a small sample. This is one of the largest data sets available in the United States. It's called the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center data set. It's 6,000 individuals from 60 sites around the country. So how is it possible to have a problem of the scale that if you're collating data from all over the country and lots of different sites in large enough numbers, how do you still get this inversion of a fundamental racial disparity in your likelihood to progress to dementia? It turns out that there's something that's well familiar to anyone who studies epidemiology, but for those of us who don't, and I'm not one of them, we have something that's called the healthy worker bias, which is a clear example of an unmeasured confounder. So to kind of put that into plain English, what it means is that instead of having a white versus Black comparison, it's more like comparing apples and oranges. All of the white individuals in the study presented from a memory clinic environment, whereas most of the Black individuals presented from a community environment. Obviously, individuals who are coming from a memory clinic are going to have a higher base rate of presenting with memory problems. And so this is the error that we are much more likely to make, where we use 2 different streams of recruitment. And so we end up recruiting 2 fundamentally different populations and attempt to compare them. This was only identified because we saw this stunning reversal of a well-known effect. I'm going to give you an example later on where it's a little bit more sinister, but you can actually find effects that are still spurious in the direction that you might anticipate. And so stay tuned for that example coming up in just a few minutes. So you might think, well, okay, thank goodness that we've got people like you, Jonathan, to talk about representation science. Unfortunately, it's not great out there when it comes to this field. The field itself is fragmented. It really is not organized across multiple areas of clinical research. There are lots of confounds. We don't have a good definition of minority. I've never heard a single thoughtful, generalizable definition of this term, but it's one that we still throw around pretty frequently. We tend to conflate a lot of terms. It's the point where we're not quite sure whether all the diverse recruitment that we've ever been able to achieve is just the byproduct of somebody who happens to be really charismatic. And then worse, just to make things a little bit more fun, there's no infrastructure to get this right. And this is, I think, the pain point that many of you are probably feeling, where there is this burden for you as individual researchers or individual research teams on individual protocols to try to build a necessary infrastructure which will have experts, tools, resources that are scalable, that are generalizable, that are affordable within the timeline of an average funded NIH study, which you already don't have enough time to do everything that you promised that you would do in your grant. So ultimately, we have these systemic failures that are left to individual study teams or research participants to overcome. So when you hear all that, you might think, that's not helping, Jackson. It's still not really clicking for me. To which point I say, just bear with me for a little bit longer, because I think we can find a way forward. So let's start with the basics. Why can't we recruit diverse representative populations to our studies? Is this something that is not well understood or well known? No, it's not. It turns out that it's actually very well understood. It is going to be, it doesn't matter what your study is, doesn't matter what your population it is, doesn't matter what your setting is, it's going to be some combination of these 11 reasons. And what is difficult is knowing which of these 11 reasons are the most upstream or the most dominant for any given protocol. Because you could be working in the same setting with the same population and have two different protocols and have a fundamentally different set of burdens that make it difficult to attract and recruit a representative population. So instead of just having this list of 11 reasons and sort of throwing darts at a board to figure out which one to try to tackle, what we've done at my research center is we've tried to model this as a selection problem. So instead of saying this is a problem of social justice, we're trying to say this is actually a scientific problem. This is a methods an issue. This is a way, this is something that we can use our scientific training and tools to try to overcome. So if you take these 11 reasons, you can actually map them on pretty easily onto an ordered workflow that starts with a sampling frame, which is going to be a subset of your catchment area, works on decisional stages of building awareness, trust, and motivation, trying to sell the study by building a strong return of value, and then moving into the only parts of this workflow that are usually well operationalized in clinical research, which are just these three areas here in green. So it's no wonder why recruitment is such a black box, because we don't have detailed protocols, measures, or even like a line item in our budgets for these other decisional stages. It makes things really, really tough. So it turns out that there are lots of implications for a science of representation based on this. There are lots of metrics that are already well validated in other areas of science that we can just pull to start to operationalize some of these things. But instead of talking about that, which is what I have done in the past, I really want to talk about the meaning of pursuing health equity, of representation, of diversity in our research studies. And that's because I believe, my fundamental belief is that when we don't have truly representative populations in our research studies, that is the canary in the coal mine that tells us that there are larger, more systemic problems with our science that may be a little bit harder for us to perceive. So let's walk through just a kind of a quick example. When we talk about disparities or group differences, historically they were essentialized. I'm talking about the history of phrenology, for example, or the emergence of scientific racism that postulated that people of different colors were evolved from completely different animals. And the suggestion here is that any differences that were observed were reified as somehow inherent. I think by and large, most of us, except for some trolls on the internet, have moved beyond this understanding because it doesn't really hold up. Instead, now we think about the world as broken in between like a set of social and structural factors and maybe some biological contributions as well. It's not necessarily 50-50, but we do need to recognize that there's an enormous amount of variance that comes from the contribution of social and structural factors. I believe that this is still limited. And the reality is that we need to start thinking about additional contributions that come not just from individual bodies, not just from larger systems and societal factors, but also from within our own scientific design. Specifically, that there are biases and error in selection, measurement, and implementation that have so far gone largely unaddressed. And so this manifests in part as a lack of diversity and lack of representation in our studies. And in addition, it also manifests in a lot of different ways here. So the good news is that this allows us to better understand contributions to a lack of diversity over and above larger societal factors that we can't control or inherent differences that may not be valid. The better news is that if we can identify a clear source of variance along this workflow, then we also have tools and solutions that may be appropriate as well. So instead of trying to solve, let's say, a measurement issue, so you've got two different groups that are responding very differently to a particular measure, instead of trying to solve that with a solution under social inequities, you solve it with a solution that has already been well developed and validated to address issues in measurement. So for example, conducting a forest plot, doing a meta-analysis, differential item functioning, looking at sensitivity analyses, things of that nature. So we already have the tools to try to address many of the problems that I think we can that we have identified and that are emergent in the problem of diversity. We just have not necessarily thought of a lack of diversity in this particular way. So there's a little bit more nuance here, as in the way that we ascribe specific variance and specific error to disparities and inequities. So going beyond the biological and the social and thinking more deeply about how we structure our scientific design and analysis means that we have not only more sources of variance to identify, but more tools to fundamentally address it. It also gives rise to a new way of thinking about certain population descriptors and certain variables out there in the world. So I'm going to use like a pretty, just like a really tiny, small, like very casual example that doesn't make anyone upset at all. Let's talk about race in science and whether it is useful as a variable. We know that it's often treated as a risk factor for disease. We know that it's usually used for one of the three following reasons in research studies. It's used as a construct for dimension reduction. It's sometimes used as a variable, like a proxy for genetic variation and ancestry. Sometimes it's used as a marker for societal factors, such as experiencing individual, interpersonal, or structural racism. It turns out that none of these are a good reason to ever use race. We should not be using race in our studies for any of these reasons, because it is a conflation of all 5 of these proposed levels of bias that I just introduced you to. So if we try to use it as a construct, we know that race is not really a great proxy of socioeconomic factors. We know that it's not a great marker of genetic variation and ancestry. We know that it doesn't tend to be helpful when we use it as an indicator of racism, because it shifts the variance from kind of structural barriers to specific individuals, and that removes a lot of variance that could be useful in our models. So we shouldn't be using race for any of these reasons. And usually at this point in this talk, people sort of react this way. They're like, okay, there's this Black guy that's talking about how diversity is super important, but we can't talk about the fact that he's Black or even measure Black people in our studies. What do we do? Well, let me walk you through just a couple of quick examples about thinking about your mechanism of action. It's not going to be the amount of melanin in someone's skin unless you're designing some sort of laser interferometry or pulse oximeters. It's just not going to be the amount of melanin in my skin. You don't want to kind of create a monolith out of that particular variable, because again, social justice reasons aside, you are throwing away useful variance in your models. Specifically, you're putting all that variance into your error terms, which means it's going to be harder to find a significant finding. There are much more useful group differentiators, things like access to care, housing, pollution, health literacy, nutrition. Be really thoughtful about that. Be really thoughtful about your referent group. If your referent group is white people, you really need to explain to yourself and to readers of your publications why that's the case. And I think, this is getting a little bit out there, but I would think a standardized set of socioeconomic factors, that is to say common data elements or CDEs, are a really, really great way, because this will give you the power to start to spot intersectional diversity and resilience factors. It tends to center exposures and systems and environments rather than trying to essentialize or reify them at the level of specific individuals. And so ultimately, race is not the third rail. It's something that we can usefully talk about even in scientific design, but racial identity can really only ever be a marker of racial identity. And so I want to give you just a quick example from this particular guy, Jackson. Don't really know what he was thinking here, but this is an example of how you can get things wrong while still thinking you're doing a good job. So again, this very unwise, very foolish researcher named Jonathan Jackson, back in 2017, published a paper looking at memory performance. So subjective cognitive concerns and objective memory measures are typically negatively, or they're particularly negatively correlated. The more you endorse these cognitive concerns, generally, the worse your memory performance. But it turns out that that was only true in white people. In Black people, we saw that there was no correlation whatsoever. And even looking at the individual measures that made up these composites, you could see that there was great internal reliability, at least it was comparable across both groups, but it was just getting these two things to play with each other that we saw these fundamental differences between white people and Black people. So we matched samples. We matched on age and education and cognitive ability and reading ability and even socioeconomic status. We actually introduced a couple of additional group differences here. But ultimately, what I want you to realize is that it's easy to believe this paper because the finding was in the direction that you expected it would be. You expected to say that these measures that have been validated on populations of privilege work really well in those groups and not so well in other groups. However, this study is horribly conflated in terms of biological disparities, social inequities, measurement error, and a selection bias. What you can see here is that with this match sample analysis, the white individuals that ended up being a match sample were so different than the overall white population that we are now, once again, just like with the example that I showed you earlier, comparing apples and oranges. This is not a good study. I would really strongly recommend that you never, ever, ever, ever try to cite it or reference it because this is the most sort of dangerous and sinister version of the problems that I'm trying to highlight here, is that when it is in the expected direction, it can reify or try to entrench problematic thinking about group differences. And so it turns out, I found out just last week, it's not just me that thinks this. The National Academies issued a report about using population descriptors in genetics research just last week. And so you can go and look this up online. But what they did was they issued a number of recommendations that are remarkably consistent with what I've highlighted here. And what's nice is that these recommendations, when you kind of ground it in the theory that I presented, they don't seem quite as arbitrary. Don't use race as a proxy, use environmental moderators and exposures, work closely with communities that you're studying. And ultimately that more than just researchers need to be working on this, we need to build a much larger, much more sustainable enterprise around this. And so although it feels controversial for someone like me to say we shouldn't be using race in our studies, the report actually included this very helpful chart where you can see all along the left side about when you should be using race in your study. The only time that they highlighted it is in health disparities research. And then even here, they recognize that not all health disparities really rely on descent-associated population groupings. So even here, you may not necessarily need to use race. So ultimately, if all this feels so confusing for you, I did a meme because I am hip and cool with the kids that makes life just much easier. So I call this the Drake rule. So instead of using race as a marker of group differences, Drake is saying, no, don't do that. What he is saying that he is much more interested in is using specific exposures and mechanisms as a marker of group differences. And so, the theory that I've kind of illustrated for you, as well as the consistent recommendations of the National Academies, seem to converge on this point. So at this point, I want to walk you through just like a handful of quick examples to kind of highlight ways to overcome certain aspects of these bias and error that I've previously identified. So let's start with the easy one, with selection bias. So this is gonna be highlighting some work that I've done in the field of Parkinson's disease, specifically working with one of the major grant the grant funders in that space, which is the Michael J. Fox Foundation. So they approached me about 5 years ago to help them with a problem. They realized that getting people to sign up for Parkinson's research was difficult in the best of cases, and those who did sign up were wealthy white men who were very, very privileged. In other words, they were individuals who kind of looked like Michael J. Fox. And so they realized, well, if we move the studies that we're doing online, if we make them virtual, and obviously this was in the years before the pandemic, they felt that that would get rid of some of the brick and mortar barriers. The idea is that if we have a study that's online that anyone can sign up for, we will overcome these problems when it comes to diversity. So what they did was they sent me kind of the demographics of their first 20,000 participants, and this is what it looked like. So for those of you who might be looking on a small screen, this particular graph is white for a reason. But it turned out that it wasn't just a lack of racial diversity. They also didn't have much in the way of appropriate representation when it came to educational level. So you might look at this and say, okay, 1 in 3 individuals has a bachelor's degree, that's fine. But then you realize that there are separate graphs, there are separate responses for master's degree, for professional school degree, and for doctoral degree. And when you add these things up together, there are more individuals with these degrees than with bachelor's degrees. And it gets better. The median income is well over $100,000. The mode of this distribution is sits like something like 150,000. So what we see here is that by no metric, there is absolutely no real representation in here, as we see from Jeff Goldblum. So the way that we try to do that is we designed the Fire Up PD study using this the recruitment funnel that I mentioned earlier. By focusing on the early stages of that recruitment funnel, you can completely eliminate selection biases when it comes to diversity. So what we ended up doing was we focused on multiple barriers. We had a really broad definition of minority because, again, the only people that were signing up for these studies were a very, very narrow privileged population of men. We had a strong focus on defining who it is that you're trying to reach, how you can reach them, what barriers you're trying to overcome. And so we did this in a small controlled study, 8 sites, 4 control. We didn't give people very much time or very much money. We gave them less than half a year. We didn't even give sites $50,000 to try to solve this. Most of the interventions focused on the things that you might think that they would, focusing on community engagements, support groups, training physicians, whether we're talking about general neurologists or community physicians, but ultimately respecting the fact that there needed to be a multi-pronged approach. So compared to site's own baseline in the 3 to 6 months before we launched the study, what we saw here is that although control sites weren't supposed to be doing anything, it's a passive control condition, nevertheless, just by orienting to these issues, and then again, passive control, we still nevertheless saw that there was a huge bump in a minoritized representation. The effect was felt, I think, much more broadly for the intervention sites, where they also saw significant bumps in diversity, but also in white identifying individuals who were relatively low income and relatively low in educational attainment. So this is one of those things where a rising tide kind of lifts all boats. And what we learned in this particular study is that what we think of as a, as a single a distribution of recruitment over time is actually better understood as maybe a convolution of 3 different recruitment kind of recruiting windows that occur at different times. So there's wave 1, which I think most of us are familiar with. When you launch that study, there are always a few people waiting right outside the door and ready to get in. And so for these individuals, there's really low researcher effort. You don't have to do a lot because they are looking for you. But then beyond that, there is a second wave where you have to put in a little bit more effort. Instead of starting at the screening stage, you might have to build a little bit of literacy. You might have to really help deliver a return of value. There's a little bit of a recruitment slowdown relative to that initial peak. And then there's wave 3, which is what those of us who talk about community engagement all the time are really encouraging folks to build. It does require significant more effort. It is relatively slow. But what's nice about it is that it is very easy to sustain over time. And you end up getting a presentation of individuals of far more modest societal privilege relative to that first peak. So instead of saying, I'm going to do the same thing over all 18 months of my recruitment window. What I would recommend, though, is sort of prioritizing for whatever wave you think you can really optimize. Beyond that, for this study, we also saw that there were these really interesting presentations when it comes to recruitment barriers. So instead of eliminating barriers to recruitment, we just measured them instead. And what we saw is that number one, although we made every effort to try to make the study appealing to marginalized and minoritized individuals, about half of all individuals who wanted to sign up for the study, actually, sorry, my math is wrong. About a third of all individuals who wanted to sign up for the study were not able to do so. So we had about 500 people complete the study, 230 could not, but they wanted to. Number one, the one thing that I want to first of all point out to you, that mistrust is relatively low on this. We often talk about the lack of trust that certain communities have as a key reason why they do or don't want to participate. Turns out that's not really why. What does tend to be a major factor are language and the digital divide. Language, because we do have this de facto expectation that everything can be done in English. I think especially with the advent of new and very fluid AI models over the course of this year, we are rapidly coming to a time where we don't necessarily need to enforce that de facto requirement. And then number two, the digital divide, which is often different than the way that most researchers often think. When we think of the digital divide, many researchers think that it's a matter of having access to the internet or not having access to the internet, instead of thinking about it in terms of what devices are able to access the internet. So for the digital divide, many individuals certainly do have access to the internet, but they're accessing it on a smartphone. They're not accessing it on a desktop or a laptop or even a tablet device in many cases. So by failing to optimize for different sort of screen sizes, reinforces what is actually a much more nuanced version of the digital divide. So there are lots of things, lots of easy ways to potentially solve the problem when it comes to diversity. We've actually replicated these findings in a couple of other studies in the years since. It turns out that by focusing on those early stages, those early phases of recruitment, you can completely eliminate any issues related to representation. Now, talking very quickly about measurement error, because this gets into designs that are maybe a little bit more familiar to this particular audience, where we're talking about embedded pragmatic clinical trials. So I was, for a number of years, part of the NIA Impact Collaboratory, which was focused on EPCTs for dementia care. And so one of the things that we recognize there is that the PRECI2 framework for pragmatic clinical trials is an excellent point of intervention to help understand why you may or may not have particular bottlenecks when it comes to representative engagement and recruitment for these studies. We often tell ourselves that because we are randomizing at the level of healthcare systems within most EPCT designs, that we don't have a problem with diversity. It turns out that's not true. Anytime you have any level of randomization, whether you're randomizing individuals or institutions, you still run the risk of creating or potentially missing selection bias. So what we are in the middle of doing now, and this paper should be going out for review any day now, is taking these 9 domains of the PRECIS-2 and sort of thinking about them at 3 levels. So instead of just having the 9 domains thought of in like this blind way, you think about each of the 9 domains at the organizational level, at the team level, and at the individual level, and recognizing how pragmatic your trial is at each of these. Instead of 9 factors, becomes sort of 27 domains, plus a potential domain of value, really helps you understand why your study is optimized to reach a certain population. And what's nice about this is we know that many PCTs sort of fail in terms of that classic lack of p-value that we're hoping to see. By thinking a little bit more carefully about the design in this way, you can really start to gird yourself against some of these trial failures. And what's even better is that by thinking more deeply about optimizing PCTs for rigorous, equitable research, you also come up with a number of equity-based outcomes that are operationalizable and that are quantifiable, regardless of what your area of focus is when you're trying to implement a PCT. So if you're thinking about design and statistics, if you're thinking about the implementation component, if you're thinking about data sources or healthcare systems, there are a wide range of different kinds of quantified estimates related to equity that you can use to complement your traditional outcomes, the traditional measures of worth for your study. So I'm running out of time here. I wanted to talk very quickly about just one or two last examples, which is, let's see. Yeah, so I'll talk about this one, which is thinking about the return of value. So this is a paper that was just accepted about 2 weeks ago, where we talk about barriers to participation, but we rarely talk about value. So Consuelo Wilkins and her team at Vanderbilt Meharry conducted this large survey to marginalized and privileged populations a few years ago. So they surveyed about 2,500 people, and ultimately they identified 11 categories of return of value. We applied those 11 categories to historical clinical trials in gynecologic oncology. And what we did was we looked at 279 trials between 1994 and 2021. And what we found is that the categories that were endorsed as the most important by Black individuals, specifically Black women, were very rarely discussed in terms of public records. So looking at the trials for these studies on ct.gov, there was some increased trends on patient-reported outcomes, but only 1% of the trials offered any kind of lifestyle risk factors. 0% discussed ancestry or remuneration. And so ultimately, what we are seeing is that we're not structuring these trials in such a way that they're even appealing to individuals. So it's not about barriers to participation, but really ensuring that we are centering things like value. So I'm going to wrap up at this point. What does this all mean? When we talk about diversity, it's a stopgap for a broader principle of inclusion that will take us all the way to what we are hopefully trying to aim for, which is representation. These three underlying terms have never been interchangeable. And it's important to remember that diversity is a floor. It is not an aspiration. Having some diversity is nice. It doesn't mean that you've got inclusion. It doesn't mean that you have representation. And we really have work to do in terms of cleaning our own house before we point the finger outside. When it comes to this work about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, we do need to start to quantify that. I think that there are ways to start to create workflows and protocols and comparative effectiveness research, because that will be the best way to take us into this new world of precision and personalized medicine. There are lots of lessons we can learn from other sectors. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. It does feel a little overwhelming. What's nice is that there are lots and lots of solutions that are already well validated, very carefully vetted, and ready for us to apply to this problem. The last thing that I want to keep people mindful of is that equity is soon going to be the primary driver of health innovation. Right now, I think all eyes are on tech, but as we start to move to precision and personalized medicine, is going to be how things like tech can ensure that we have equity and true representation in our clinical research studies. So the last thing that I want to do is kind of offer the words of wisdom from one of the, I think, leading lights in the world of thinking about scientific inquiry and philosophy, which is MC Hammer, who wrote on Twitter 2 years ago, "When you measure, make sure you include the measure." So that's my talk. I'm happy to kind of stick around for a few comments and thoughts, but I wanted to say thanks to everybody for paying attention, and hopefully we can have a few points of fun discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say to everybody, you're welcome to put anything in the chat, but you're also welcome to just unmute and ask questions or bring any comments forward. I'm going to start off with a question, because I think that one of the things you actually sent me a paper on this, that you talked a lot about barriers and things like that, but you know about the iAcquire trial, for example, and we've thought about the barriers with regard to that, but one of the things on your graph was the time commitment, and that is a big issue for individuals to commit to clinical trials often, and I think that one is often overlooked. Even for trials that are much less intensive than iAcquire, we talk about the language and even the digital divide, but we don't really talk about the idea of there being a time commitment to participation in clinical trials. And we definitely don't think about remuneration for that time. Can you speak a little bit about the challenges of that and what what we need to do to address that?
Yeah, so Dr. DeLuca, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because this is one of the things that we really need to start to shift our thinking about sort of moving outside of the realm of barriers and trying to remove those barriers towards incentives and some sort of building value in the way that is easy for folks like us folks like people who look like me to perceive. So with iAcquire, one of the difficulties is nominally, I'm going to say nominally, because one of the difficulties is nominally thinking about this time commitment. But in the same way that I have previously said things like, when we talk about trust in clinical trials, it's usually not really about trust. Similarly, when we talk about time commitment, it's usually not about time commitment. So Dr. DeLuca, let me give you like just a personal example based on what you told me earlier today. You've got a son that plays lacrosse, and you go to a lot of his games and practices, and over the years, I'm sure that you have helped out and done a lot of that work. It's not because you particularly like lacrosse, right? It's because you have a powerful incentive to kind of dedicate and allocate that much time towards somebody that you love who is interested in it. Similarly, when it comes to the way that we structure and design our clinical trials, time commitment is only a problem when there is no other incentive to make it worthwhile. If you do have an incentive structure, so like one of my last slides where I presented the return of value in gynecologic oncology trials, time commitment is a factor because none of the other things that Black women really like in a clinical trial were on offer. And so when those things are not available, when those things are not even referenced in a public-facing entry, it's easy to say, okay, this is a time commitment issue. So when you have built-in, much more substantial, much more responsive, much more dynamic returns of value, something that means that somebody's getting something out of it, then what you find is that time commitment is usually not quite so much of an issue. So there are ways of overcoming it. So there's a National Academy's report about recruitment to clinical trials that was published last May of 2022, that really speaks to this. But ultimately, it means that we need to be much more thoughtful and nimble around remuneration, whether we're talking about financial remuneration, whether we're talking about reimbursement. Because the truth is that for many trials, individuals are effectively going out of pocket to participate, right? They have to take time off work. They might have to get elder care or child care or pet care. They might have to pay for parking. It turns out that it's not really a time commitment. It's just that there is a hassle and you're not getting enough out of it to justify that hassle. So when you think about structuring elements of iAcquire in terms of front loading, really emphasizing advertising, the benefits that people get, potentially modifying that structure so that people can get, so that they can experience those benefits much more quickly. What you find is that will be a strong mitigator of the concern around time commitment. So it really is about being as nimble as you can. And so I would highly recommend that you kind of cross-reference the structure of the study with that Wilkins paper to see which of these returns of value you're actually offering towards different marginalized and minoritized groups.
Thank you. There's some other questions, and actually there's also some people that say great talk in the chat, so you're welcome to comment, to see those. I want you to hear those. But Jacqueline, we'll go ahead and go to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for a great talk. It was very informative, and I thought it was helpful to talk about all the things we could do along the way to make our research more equitable. But one of the issues that I'm really struggling with is that racism is baked into a lot of the assessments we use, whether it's BMI, pulse oximetry, spirometry. How do we, and then I'm sure it's baked in other ways that we haven't yet figured out or deduced how to pull it apart. How do you manage to deal with that when racism is like baked into the lowest levels of the research?
Yeah, so the good news is that there's a lot that you can do. The bad news is that there's a lot that you can do. And so it really depends on how you want to try to tackle this problem. It sounds like, first of all, you're not necessarily talking about the selection bias. That was kind of like a big chunk of my talk. What I didn't have as much time to present is thinking about implementation bias and thinking about measurement error that often occurs because of things like not just racism, but sexism, being very centric to US culture, but like upper middle class US culture, all those things. There are things that you can do to, if you've got the time, you can work to validate or revalidate studies. If you don't, you can do something simple, like you can do a meta-analysis, you can do a sensitivity analysis, you can do something like a differential item functioning. If you've got the skill, most biostatisticians are pretty comfortable using these techniques if they're new to you. But what you can do is, instead of working to try to eradicate all of it at once, right now your job is just to quantify it and point it out. And then what you can do is, there are a second set of statistical tools that you can start to leverage, like different kinds of transportation tools and G estimation, which are really popular in epidemiology, to try to offset some of that bias in real time. So it's like a little bit of a two-stage process. But what's nice is, again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to sort of look at this wall of racism in front of you and say, I don't know what to do, I'm just one person. You can start to just sort of chip away at the little bits that are easiest for you to measure, easiest for you to quantify, publish, communicate those results. And then what's nice is that gives you a really great foothold to start to leverage things like inverse probability weighting to try to offset that within your sample. So I would recommend take it one step at a time. This is not like you're not like looking at this entire enormous pie and having to eat it all in one go. Just like little bits here and there. And what you're likely to find is that it's not just racism that you're going to be kind of finding that's baked into your results. There's going to be a lot of isms. And so this is why I think the national academies are starting to recommend against using something like race as a group differentiator, because it turns out that while race may be part of it, it's usually that race is masking, and it's a poor correlate or poor proxy for a lot of other isms that are kind of banding together, that are having disproportionate effects on individuals of color. So again, be careful about how you leverage those group differentiators, because that is going to be like the most important decision that you make. But I think that there's a lot that you can do. And it turns out, like, watch a couple of videos on YouTube on how to do differential item functioning, and you'll be good to go in order to try to kind of identify these things.
Thank you. Carla is next. It's interesting you mentioned YouTube, though. Everybody learns everything from YouTube nowadays.
Nowadays, yeah, or if not TikTok, depending on your age group.
Hi, Carla. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your talk. It was very informative, and I feel like I kind of have a unique perspective because I've been on both sides of the table.
Yes.
One as a parent, looking for interventions for a child with a disability, and then also in my professional space, working for a national nonprofit that is looking to recruit, and I'm working in community engagement with diverse communities. And what I find in the feedback that I hear, and also from a parent perspective, oftentimes the researchers who are recruiting are phrasing and presenting things about what's the benefit for the research from that perspective, and very rarely expressing that return of value that you mentioned for the individual who's going to be involved. And definitely, I find that with pediatric communities, parents want whatever's best for their child, but still, I think people definitely look at things like, how are you presenting that to me? It's always in the what you're doing for science, or what you're doing to help this research find these cures, but it's really not addressing the fact of, well, what's in it for me? How can I benefit? And that kind of goes on all levels. And definitely there are so many barriers to participation for, sometimes people have asked me, well, how come I can't do this on a Saturday? And usually it's because the researcher like, I don't work on Saturday. And so we have to look at that when we're recruiting any population to take down some of those most obvious barriers. Because I've had some, community members who are a little more in tune with kind of the research world say, well, you got to meet me where I'm at. And so that's something that is so critical. And so when I'm out in the community and I'm, my bottom line is I am trying to get people to sign up for Trial Match or those different programs, it's still presenting it in a way that they are picking up on. This is something that is beneficial for you. It's not about me and trying to get my research goals. I'm trying to provide something of value to you, and I want you to be aware that it's out there. So that's what I see on both sides, either any kind of, it could be a pediatric model or an adult model. It just has to, that return of value has to be the number one thing that is presented to communities.
I could not agree more. And I love that you said what's in it for me. I'm going to put the paper from Anne Oluloro in the chat because that's the title of the paper, What's in It for Me? Looking at return of value in gynecologic oncology trials. And I think everything that you said is spot on. And if I can sort of yes and you for one moment, someone like you is in, I just want everyone to know this. This is less for you and more for everyone else on the Zoom. What is difficult about the work that you do is that you are working in community engagement with the expectation that you are overcoming problems of systems, of larger society, of the institution that you're working for, and the selection, measurement, and implementation issues that I've already highlighted. And so that can make your role incredibly fraught and incredibly stressful because any one of these things can go wrong. And it will be up to you to sort of be nimble and dynamic enough to be responsive at the individual patient and participant level. And that is always an incredibly tough balancing act. That you have built up this kind of rapport and trust. And sort of the cautionary tale is if you decide that you want to quit and do something else, none of that rapport and none of that trust transfers. And so what is always best is instead of building trust, work on building empowerment, work on building capacity so that you can engage with communities as equal partners. Because if you don't do it that way, they're going to walk as soon as, as soon as Carla gets tired, when she decides that she wants to do something else, all of that infrastructure goes out the door with her. And so it's just incredibly important. Again, social justice aside, for the sake of consistent, sustainable science, that we engage in deep community partnerships in order to kind of promote recruitment and engagement.
Thank you, Jill.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering if anyone on this call has served like as chair of the IRB or has any experience in that way. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the question before about including value in discussions with recruitment, because first of all, I haven't thought about it that way before, so that I will start to think about it that way. But there is definitely like a harms and benefits section, and the benefits is often what you're talking about. But I do feel like there's a little bit of hesitation. I don't think it's coming from me, but maybe just in general about presenting sort of an unbiased, just the facts, and then you decide if you want to participate, in this study or not. So has anyone on this call been chair of the IRB or had larger roles in the IRB? Can you comment on that?
This is Liz, and I've been a panel member. I have not been a chair though. And at least in our discussions, you can't oversell it, right? Like if your purpose of your study is to test if a constraint-induced movement therapy helps, you can't advertise that it does help until you know, or that there's at least sound. So I think that's where it's a struggle. When I struggle with it too, because I don't always do intervention studies that we can promise a benefit. It's more, hopefully this will help the larger masses in the future as we try to understand what are these associations or relations or causes. So I would love to hear other people to weigh in how they navigate when there is no direct benefit to the participant. There isn't. And so you can't advertise that, and the IRB won't consider that, especially like with children where they are more restrictive if it's a greater than minimal risk protocol.
So let me just jump in and just gently encourage you to think a little bit more broadly about what value is. Because I think the first thing that we think of is like, oh gosh, maybe we can give somebody some more money. Maybe we can get like return research results more quickly and more directly to them. And these are the only values that I can think of. Everything else the IRB is going to like shut down. It's okay. Like, you don't have to think about value in those terms. Again, if you look at the Wilkins return of value paper, some of those elements of value come directly as a consequence of participation itself. And it's not a matter of selling or overselling or wondering if you're being coercive, and more just about making sure that the study participation is done in a way that respects the autonomy of the individual. And in many cases with pediatric studies, the familial dyad. So thinking about a chance to talk to other families who are going through the same thing, thinking about the chance to be engaged in increased medical monitoring, thinking about the progress that's been made in the bioethics literature about what participation looks like is all really necessary. So in some cases, and this is work that I have done, you have to re-educate your local IRB about what the latest findings are. So for example, many IRBs are still oriented to the view that paying individuals a little bit more money to participate is necessarily coercive, and that they are much more quickly to apply that logic when it comes to marginalized individuals. It turns out that bioethics has solved this problem like 20 years ago, and that they have really moved on with their thinking. So sometimes you just need to kind of cite the contemporary literature on this point. But what is more likely to be effective is to recognize that return of value means a lot of intangibles that we don't value as scientists. And so we necessarily inadvertently discard when it comes to the patient or the participant experience. So sometimes, like, again, for pediatric studies, like the chance to get like a really cool sticker that glows in the dark and maybe is like scratch and sniff, like that's all the value that a kid needs to spend an afternoon with you. Doing something that might be really, really hard or inconvenient or painful. It's just recognizing that it's not necessarily appropriate to fit all of that in the box. But in general, what I would recommend is thinking about return of value in 3 categories: time, money, and information. So money is going to be the one that makes the IRB flip. Information is going to be the one that makes us as scientists a little bit queasy, because sometimes we're investigating something that's not quite actionable. But if you can give people a little bit of time, IRB is never going to be mad at you for that. They're never going to be upset about that. It's not going to necessarily make you uncomfortable, but it can provide a lot of value, and it can make it worth it for them to invest their time in you, because you're giving that back to them. Especially if you're trying to describe a larger class of scientific problems. So for example, instead of me going to a community group and recruiting for an Alzheimer's clinical trial, I can say, here's what aging looks like. Here's what dementia looks like. Here's what the risk factors are. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And it turns out that just offering that time and a little bit of information, that falls outside the purview of IRB, and it is an incredibly effective recruitment source. And it's an even better retention source for us, but if you've got like a longitudinal component to your study. So thinking about time, money, and information a little bit more broadly, recognizing that for many families, what they're looking for is a chance to build some community and to get a few answers and some peace of mind. All of this, fits under this umbrella of return of value, and it doesn't necessarily fit in that box of risks and benefits that the IRB is looking for. So we have to think a lot more broadly about these constructs.
Thank you so much. I mean, that really is interesting. I guess we are very used to thinking about value kind of in a singular manner, because we're used to the IRB putting limits on, you know, even what we call value and how we describe something. And what I think what you're saying is we need to think about it differently. That value, we need to think about the value from the perspective of the participant, right? Versus what the IRB defines.
Absolutely. And so this is not an end run against the IRB. Like this, I'm not trying to say like, here's one weird trick to like fool the IRB into running your study.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that the IRB has a very very concrete circumscribed set of determinants to decide whether a study can go ahead or not. Many of the things that we consider value, especially for marginalized groups, are outside of the purview of the IRB. Definitely run it by them, definitely check with them. But what you will often find is the information, the time that people are looking for are outside of like the formalized protocols of the study design. So it's usually 99% of the time, it's totally okay by the IRB to talk about these other things as some element of value.
Well, I want to be aware of time. We've really kept you past what we asked you to commit to, Dr. Jackson. So thank you for hanging around. But I don't want to shut anybody off. If you have a final question, please unmute and speak up. And as Dr. Jackson mentioned, he will be at Virginia Tech next week. So that will be another opportunity. If anybody has a burning question, I can send you the Zoom link. Even though he'll be in person, there'll be a Zoom option as well. So if you want to continue the discussion, I'm happy to share that link with anybody. Just contact us and we'll be happy to do that. But I thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. It doesn't look like there's is there any other questions before we let Dr. Jackson go?
I just have one comment, just
Okay.
a reminder to everyone who's on the call that the first See Progress Book Club will be Monday at noon, and we'll be discussing the book Noise.
Well, with that, Dr. Jackson, I just can't thank you so much again. This was a wonderful talk. I've already been asked by several individuals if they can get the link to share with their lab members and things like that. So I think it will be dispersed well beyond just this group. So I thank you for that, because I think the message is very powerful and helps us all reconceptualize what we can do to promote representation. I think when we put it in terms of just diversity, as you pointed out, we often think about it as such a big problem. And we think about not diversity, but when we put it in terms of just social justice and we don't think about the components of that, we often think of it as too big a problem. And what we need to be is addressing the individualized components, many of which you pointed out. So I thank you so much for this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you, Dr. DeLuca, and anyone else who might be around.
Okay.
So again, thank you all for your time and even for staying overtime with me.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm so glad that you were here, and we look forward to visiting with you and many of you in the future.
All right,
Thanks
take care.
again.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.